Go.
All right. So it looks like we have video. If you have any problems with video, please say so. I'm occasionally monitoring the computer over here to see your comments. First of all, I would like to welcome you for your patience. Thank you for your patience in waiting for us to get started today. We're running about 15 minutes late. This will be about a 2-hour program entitled Secrets of the Quad. This is when we start to get real mad scientists tonight. And we go into the depths and the shadows and the backsides of what the quad really is. Okay, I can see we have video on the other side there.
Kill that.
Okay, I will kill that sound. There we go. All right, so a lot of people look at the quad and they see it as just a convenient cubby, something that is an easy way for us to put some terms in. They all look at the sheet. Let's run that around at that wall chart there. You're all familiar with that wall chart here, the Dramatica chart. You can download copies of this, and it looks nice and flat, and it's made up of quads within quads within quads within quads. So basically, we have just a bunch of nested terms, and a lot of people think it's just a chart of semantics, and that's about all there is to it. And even when we do the 3D projection of it, which you've mostly seen, it looks like a 3D chess set, even when we do that, a lot of people think it's just saying, oh, well, this level deals with this level deals with that. And that's all there is to the quad. It's just a little cubby hole that holds 4 items. Let's roll back around over here. Thanks, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Much appreciated. Okay.
And ignore this white. That's actually there's.
So I'm
video.
actually up to. I can get up to
You can
here,
get
and I'm
up, yeah.
actually there. Oh, so half of my head is not cut off. That's amazing. It feels like half of my head is cut off. All right, here is a quad. This is the simplest quad you're going to see because it has nothing in it. And we could put anything we wanted into a quad, but you might think that any 4 items could do it. You could put oranges and pizza and a rock and a new movie in there, and it would be a valid quad just because it has 4 items in it. But in fact, there's a special relationship that exists within a quad. Not just one relationship, but many relationships that operate at the same time. And they're all doing different things, and they're all in sync, and none of them run into each other. It's kind of an amazing little unit, but it's all hidden. It's all hidden behind the scenes. It's based on position. It's based on what each section is supposed to mean and what the relationships are supposed to mean in a quad. And those are the secrets of the quad because you don't see them. That's all you see. If you would bring up that first video, I've got a few web pages together here that I'm going to call Jim on to bring up tonight if he would be so good, so bold. And the first one we're bringing up, and they're just in order of the, right.
It's going to take a second.
Yeah. We're overtaxing the the processor here, but we're going to make it happen. All right. Just keep swimming, swimming, swimming. And there we go. Now, in a moment, you'll see there's a quad there. There we go. Okay, and if you just scroll down, these are some of the things we're going to be showing tonight. There's that quad, and we keep on going all the way to the bottom of the page, and we're going to see the relationships of the quad, the linear form, the nonlinear form, all this scientific stuff, but we're going to tie it right in with writing. It's the 3D model, rotations of the quad and how all that works and why it works and where it came from, relationships within the quad, different kinds of pair relationships and what they mean, and how relationships change as we rotate through the entire structure, and how we can determine how characters are going to relate from one to another because of their position within a quad, and how all this ties in with your writing and your structure, and also objective and subjective quads with 2 different views from the inside if you're part of the quad. And let's see what else is in there that we might show them. Oh, yes, and then looking at the quad as a family or as a bunch of independent units, and then talking about how things flip and rotate a little bit. And ultimately, I think that may be all. Yes, let's get rid of that. Okay, now let's go on to the second of these little items. And that will be loading up now. Quads, as complex as they are not something that's just a little cubby to hold things, and they didn't come up overnight. Quads, as you can see from this chart, there's a lot of work that went into figuring out how they worked. And this is from one of my sketch pads during the development of Dramatica. And you know, everybody wants to get some people in the room here. Gather around, and it's over here on my computer too, so you can see it there as well. Anyway, and that's one of my sketch pads, and it shows some different kinds of forces at work. And one of them, the one number 4 in the lower left-hand corner, that's actually going to talk about the operations that happen to the quad that twists it and turns it, because you often hear us talk about it as a Rubik's Cube and how things flip and rotate. Well, why do they flip and rotate? How do we know in what direction when you answer questions? What is the story engine doing to make that happen? Okay, next picture. I explained this to Teresa the other day, my life partner of the last 17 years. This was actually explained up in Salem a few years ago when this next picture you'll see came from. And she determined, after hearing me hold forth and speak about the quad for about an hour, trying to explain all its niceties to her as quickly as I could, that she had a quad of her own. And this was Teresa's quad. This is what she thought a quad should be like. There you go, guys. That's Teresa's quad.
It's one of the bottom two.
Okay. It's, hold on, this went into...
You should.
What?
Right on the board, maybe.
Well, no, I don't want to reproduce it. I got the picture right here, so I'll just... Okay. For some reason, it's going to... Yeah, okay. Here's Teresa's quad. There you go. And that's what she thought after I had given her, if you can't read it, it says time in the lower right, space in the upper left. She got that part right. And then the upper right one says slap the face, and the lower left one says screw the pooch. So she'd had enough about quads at that point, and the conversation sort of died from there. Now, one more picture forward, please. We're starting with these just to put a groundwork in. You know, everyone takes Dramatica way too seriously. We did when we were creating it. We did for many years. But actually, it's just a way of looking at the world based on narrative. And our next one is going to show me explaining something I no longer remember what it was. It's actually a still from a video up on YouTube somewhere. So if anybody wants to look at that, I don't know what those quads are, or the letters. I think I'd have to watch my own video to see what it was I meant at that point. Next one is one of Chris's attempts at dealing with quads before we came up with the little quad structure. So let's move on to the next. Item. And don't worry, we're going to be explaining all about the quad once I get through all of this interesting anecdotal material. It'll be worth your while. I mean, tell me it's not already, right? I mean, this is so cool. Okay. You know, what I should have done is just pick up my computer and hold it in front of yours with a regular video, and then I could look at that. Because this is like Jim. You don't see behind the scenes, but Jim's got like 14 windows open to try and transfer the image onto the live feed. Anyway, but that's Chris's version. He called it writer's blocks before there was a program by that name. And that's one way we were trying to deal with quads, is to figure out how things lined up. And so we put them all on a shoelace, I think it was, and drilled through and put names on the different sides. And we'd rotate them around when we were in a more linear form of understanding how all this worked. And that's all that we're going to start with. And then later on, we're going to pick up with the next one in line. So, okay. First thing about the quad is that you can put stuff in it. Now, some of the things you might put in it would be items that already have a sense that 4 things belong together. So you might put in earth and fire and water and wind. And if you wanted to do that in the quad, then you put earth up here. I'll tell you why in a minute, okay? Earth and water and fire and wind. Now, think about those 4 items. Earth and water, they have substance. They are stuff. They have a solidarity to them, or at least, you know, you can push against them and really feel them. But fire and wind, those two are kind of ethereal. They're like a generation removed or a fractal level above or something. They're more complex. Just like space and time are more complex, mass and energy, that's pretty straightforward, or at least it appears so at the surface. But if you put earth and water in here, then you have a relationship between the two. Earth can make water change its course, water can erode earth, and so on, and splash over it and pool in it. But then you want to look at fire and wind. And you put wind over here. Wind can also affect earth in its changing its shape. And fire, you would put down here. And you'd look at that and say, that's a valid quad because they have a certain relationship. And that relationship also is the same as this quad that we're all familiar with, which is mass and energy and space and time. So think about it for a moment. Mass and energy, space and time. Mass and earth. Of earth, fire, wind, and water, which one is the most like mass? Well, earth is. It's the most like mass. And if you look at the wind, okay, all right, the water, I'm going to put W and W. This is water here, water and wind, okay? So if you're looking at water down here, which of these things is most like? And it's most like energy because those have a direct relationship at a certain level. Mass and energy, kind of linear. Earth and water, you can touch them. You can hold them in your hand. You can cup your hand. Linear. But when you get to fire and wind, that's something else, just like space and time. So that's one way a quad works. You can also put up some other familiar things. Like, for example, you could put up a quad here, which contains the strong forces, the weak forces, electromagnetism, and gravity. Okay? Now, the strong forces and the weak forces belong in here. And it would be my suspicion that in physics, that's what you find in like basic physics, where these only four forces exist. And the strong forces would be up there, and the weak forces would be over here, and electromagnetism would be over there, and gravity would be over here. And we begin to see something. Fire and time and gravity, all those things are kind of an odd man out. Which of these things is not like the others? If you have to pick one, it's going to be the one on the lower left-hand corner. And that's true of every quad in Dramatica. It's true of every quad in Dramatica. Now, I'm going to complete this quad here, but it's not a real quad. This is just so it looks nice on screen. But suppose you wanted to put in solid, liquid, gas, and what do you put down here? Plasma, okay? Again, we see these things happening over and over. The thing that's most like mass belongs in the upper left. That's what the quad is designed to do, is to replicate mass and energy in space and time so that the thing that's most like mass is up here, the thing that's most like energy is down here. Those two are always going to be at the same kind of level. These two are going to be a more complex level above them. One of them is going to be the most tangible of the two, and the other one's going to be the one that's just a little tweaked, okay? Plasma, gravity, fire, and time. They're all the ones that are a little bit out of there. You can do that with noun, adjective, noun, verb, adjective, and adverb. Now, an adjective and an adverb, in school, you always knew they were more complicated than a noun and a verb. Noun and a verb you get pretty easy. Okay, noun, most like mass, right? Okay, verb, most like energy, moving, energy, you know, transitive, to do something, okay? And then you've got adjective, which is the ordinary one, and adverb. Adjective always seemed like it made a lot more sense to me because it was just a modifier of a thing. It described the quality of it. But then you have to describe a quality of an action, of a verb, you know? And when you get to those adverbs, which belong down here, they're also a little wanky, okay? So that is the first thing if you wanted to learn quads in Dramatica for writing purposes, or just for theory study purposes, or to look to the mind, or to look to the universe and say, why do we keep seeing things in fours and there's always one wanky one? Why do we see that those appear to be all that there are in that family? And there's something out of left field, and that there's two levels, a simple level and a complex next dimension level. Why is that? Because that's the way the mind works. The mind works in fours. We have a mind that is made from the interference pattern between our spatial and temporal selves. We look at things through space, what the situation is, and time, how things are changing, and it's the friction between those that sparks self-awareness conceptually, okay, to be a little poetic about it. When that happens, we can understand that the mind is a machine made of time. It's one dimension above all of this. Self-awareness is up here, looking at these things. It's in a fifth place. I won't call it a fifth dimension because it's just an intangible. But the mind doesn't exist in the brain. The mind is generated by the brain. It's fostered by the brain. The brain operates in 4 dimensions, and therefore it only allows the mind to see 4 dimensions directly. Everything else is a inference, a calculation, a synthesis of 4 dimensions that we can see in any given area. But there are always going to be these 4 primaries. And if you don't have 4, like for example, earth, wind, water, wind, and fire, and metal in Japanese tradition, as opposed to just having these 4 elements, they had 5. What they were actually doing is moving into the next quad, or quad up, they're moving into another quad. And in so doing, they have now got the first item of another quad of things, but they're treating it as if all 5 belong together. But you can look at that and say, well, metal, isn't that part of earth, really? And don't you need fire to make it? And so you start to look at it in that sense. And that's how we develop the big old chart with all the words, as we ask questions like that. Well, isn't metal really a product of fire and earth? And you have to use the bellows with the wind to make it and cool it with the water and everything. So all this stuff kind of makes metal that doesn't really belong at the same level. Which words belong at which level? So this gives us a sense of how the quad works conceptually, and all of it later we'll find up here at the top. This final quad I'm going to draw for now, but I'll explain it later. I've talked about it a lot. But if there's 4 basic dimensions that we see in the outside world when we look out, then if our minds are at some 5th level and we turn around and look in, we're also going to see 4 things. We're going to see the 4 parts of the mind that exist underneath self-awareness, that generate self-awareness. And those 4 parts are knowledge and thought and ability and desire. And that's the same relationship we've seen in all these other quads. Knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. And what does that mean? How does that relate? Well, let's relate it to the mother quad here of looking at the world, the mass and energy and space and time, the old Einsteinian elements that we're dealing with in relativity. Let's look at that over here and say that knowledge is the mass of the mind. Okay? Basically, what you know is the most solid thing you've got in your head out of everything you've got. And thought works with knowledge at the same level, just like energy works with mass, like water, and earth, like liquid and solid, like, it works pretty much the same way. That's why they're in those positions, the exact same positions. So knowledge is a thing like mass. You can apply energy to it, like throwing a ball. You can take some knowledge and move it around. You can use energy to take a bunch of bricks and build yourself a wall or something. You can take your thoughts and take a bunch of knowledge and create an understanding, some construct of knowledge, as it were. But just like in E equals mc squared, you can say that mass and energy can convert from one to another. And because of E equals mc squared, we all know, maybe we don't know the equation so well as to what part does which, but we do know that a little bit of mass, like a little bit of uranium, can turn out an awful lot of energy when you get fission or when you get fusion. Changing mass to energy. And when you change energy into mass, it takes a tremendous amount of just pure energy to make a thing, even one atom, even one particle in an atom. Okay? Similarly, a single bit of true knowledge can generate an awful lot of thought, but it takes a tremendous amount of thought to arrive at a single bit of real knowledge. All right? And ability and desire, what's that have to do with like space and time? It's like, well, first of all, you can see ability and desire, they seem that next level up. They seem like they're both really don't belong at the same simple level, the linear level. They're kind of a nonlinear or fractal level up there. And ability is really saying it's a comparison of what you know to what you don't know. And that's the definition of like space. It's a simple way of talking about it. Where there is mass and where there isn't mass, the distance between mass, whatever's between one piece of mass and another piece of mass, although we know mass exists in space and space exists throughout mass, we don't want to go into theoretical physics. We just want to look at it simply and say the same way that space and mass exist, knowledge exists within ability, but the distance in between one piece of knowledge and another tells us how much stuff we don't know, what's in the middle that we don't know, and that determines how much ability we actually have by how much we don't know. And desire, in terms of being like time, okay, in our real lives, Well, time is where desire comes from. We compare the way things were to the way things are to the way things might be. And when we do, we're doing a temporal comparison and saying we prefer this one over that one. Without time, we couldn't do that. Desire comes from our time sense. Okay. So, in the end, this quad form can be used in this way. But let's now look at something that's a little more practical from here. We're going to take a quad and we're going to talk about something inside the quad, not how the quad form and position determines the relationships of items by their nature, simultaneous to what we just saw, with the upper left meaning one thing compared to the lower right. And that's consistent throughout the entire chart, those same relationships. This is at one level, that's at another level. This one's the most massive or knowledge-like, this one's the most energy or thought-like, and so on. And that's the same in every single quad, at every single level for writers. However, we also can see that there are relationships. Once we put an element in here, whatever this element is, it could be at the top level of the Dramatica chart for writers, a situation, fixed attitude, activity, and manipulation, or we used to call them universe, physics, mind, and psychology. I liked universe, physics, mind, and psychology at that type level of the chart in Dramatica, that top quad, because if you had universe, physics, mind, and S-Y-C-H in psychology, it was very easy to describe that universe was a fixed state of affairs externally. And physics was an external process, some kind of an activity or physical process, an avalanche, whatever. It's something physical. Mind is an internal fixed state. It's an attitude. It's a fixation. It's a prejudice, something that doesn't change. And psychology is an internal process, a manner of thinking. You start at one place and you reason your way or you feel your way to another state, and the process is flawed or it's good. It doesn't say anything about that. It just says this is the process of working things through. This is your attitude, your fixed attitude, in which, holding that, you try to work things through within your fixed attitude. But when you do that, you can see that the top half of this quad is external, and the bottom half of the quad is internal. And if you then circle this, you've got two processes, psychology and physics. And if you circle this, which is the more simple one, universe and mind, a lot easier to understand because they're not moving. That's why they're easier to understand. They're stationary. And when you look at universe and mind, you have two states. Now, what this means is that when you're writing with Dramatica and you're making choices about that top level, you're really looking at where's the problem? Or another way to look at it is where should we look for the solution? Okay, it really amounts to the same thing in Dramatica. Where the problem is, the solution will be found right next door. So if you want to do that, you can look at your whole world. Now here's a tip for you in your everyday life, and something that you want to be doing when you're structuring a story in Dramatica, is ask yourself, is the problem I'm experiencing the actual source of the problem, ground zero, the place where the pebble dropped that created all the ripples that go throughout a story, or the incident or attitude or expectation or dashed hope or feeling of pressure that's ruining my whole damn life, okay? What actually is the heart of that? What is the cause of it? And you want to find it so you can solve it? So the first thing you can ask is, the most broad stroke level, is it an external or internal state or process? Because no matter what you look at in the world, as we've seen with adjectives and adverbs and nouns and gases and strong and weak forces, there's always going to be, comes down to, is an external or internal state or process. And you can pretty much figure that out. Is this caused by the way things are? Is it caused by the way things are going? Something that's, you know, a process we've got to stop because it keeps, rust never sleeps. It's eroding my metal. That's not good. Or I'm stuck in an upside down boat. Or this guy has a bad attitude and every time I show up at work, it's a personality conflict. He just hates me. Scrooge has a bad attitude. Or the psychological thing, which is where you talk yourself out of asking somebody for a date because you think they'll say no when you had confidence to begin with. Well, then you just cascade it into a difficulty. So every problem in life, if you want to define it, you can rule out 3/4 of the places to look for the source of your problem and its solution. just by determining its external, internal state or process. Now, every quad in Dramatica is not an external or internal state or process, just the top level. You go down below that, and you go to the next level down in the 3D chart. And again, the 3D chart is like that, those 4 different stacked planes, one of them at the top level. Okay, here, that's where genre is most affected by structure, or where structure most affects genre is at the top level. That's a quad. And then under that, there's a quad of quads. Okay, so as you see, it goes down like that. And this is where plot has its most impact. And the next level down is where you have your variations. That's where theme has its greatest impact. And then at the very bottom level, you have your elements, which is where character is most impacted by structure. Or another way to look at it, if you're a structuralist, is this is where you can have the greatest impact on building the structure of your characters. This is where you can build the structure of your theme, the structure of your plot, and the overall genre that you're working with. That's where you have the greatest structural impact. Now, it's real interesting in terms of storytelling. Storytelling is kind of the reverse. Is storytelling is very refined up here at the genre level. It's hugely refined. And when you go down to the next level, it's a little less refined. The next level, it's a little less refined. And when you come down here, storytelling doesn't have nearly the impact on character that it does on genre, on the mood and the feel, and the kinds of elements that go into something. So it's kind of an inverse relationship between the structure and the storytelling. And that's very interesting. You have big, broad stroke things for genre, so you don't have much finesse, but lots of finesse in storytelling at genre. And down here, by the time you get into character, you have a lot of finesse over here in structure, but you don't have as much in storytelling because you're locked into the structure. An archetype that's reason has to be an archetype that's reason, and you really can't move out of that in your storytelling, or you're violating your own structure. So you're really stuck more with structure at the bottom and storytelling. So I'd say probably, if you look at it, maybe you have 1/4 of the impact and 3/4 of the impact up here until you get down at the bottom, and you've got 3/4 of the impact on your story and structure here, and 1/4 over in storytelling as you move between the two. So that's how vertical quads move between them. And I think we're not quite getting all of that over there. Yeah, for the last little bit. Okay, good. So anyway, so that's a sense of how the 3D structure works. Now what we're going to do is go back to this thing with these little elements, whatever they're called. And this is kind of a hodgepodge. I put it in a basic order, and I've already violated it about 14 times because I go off on tangents, because I happen to really like this stuff, and if something comes up that intrigues me, I'll run with it. But the first point I wanted to make was that there was a quad, a little cubby, but it's not that, it's more than that. And then give you the examples, 4 things that could be put in it with the plasma and the gravity and stuff. And then I wanted to move to this, before I got all sidetracked with myself. 4 kinds of relationships within a quad. Now, one of the things you can do, and I'm going to bring that up here and point it at the camera, it's the easiest way to do this, I think, is if I brought up the Dramatica software, and I went over to this page here. Let's see how this works. Oh.
It doesn't work.
Yeah, it works better than trying it on the screen.
Well, I can bring it up.
Okay, Jim says he can bring it. We'll go with that. Okay, we're going to bring up the Dramatica software. We're going to talk about relationships that exist within a quad from one element to another. Now, we're not talking about these being the ones that are at one level and these being at another level. You're going to find these relationships in a quad. There'll be this relationship between those 2 items and this relationship that we've already covered. But you're also going to have a relationship like this, a relationship like that, one like this, and one like that. So in the end, you've got this and that, and that, and that. And then you also have this one and this one on the 2 sides of the quad. And they have different meanings, okay? What you have is this one is called a dynamic relationship, both of these, dynamic relationships. And these kind are companion relationships. And these kind, the vertical ones, okay, are dependent relationships. There's 2 of them. And every quad, one of each kind is going to be positive and the other is going to be negative. And what does that mean to a writer? And soon you'll find out what it means to your love life. Okay, what it means to a writer is that if we're just dealing with only, in this quad, the dynamic relationships, one's positive and one's negative. Now, the theory never advanced far enough to tell you which one was which. We can't have you answer a question and know which relationship between these elements is going to be a positive one or negative. And here's what positive and negative means. Okay, a positive dynamic relationship is where you have two forces that are opposed, but they're like the loyal opposition. You smash against each other and it creates a spark, and that spark synthesizes something new that saves the day. Well, that's a positive relationship. You're both intact, but you've created something new because of your sparring, okay? Whereas a negative dynamic relationship is when you bash each other into the ground until there's no potential left and you're both gone. There's nothing left, okay? That's a negative relationship. And we know those in real life. We know those with people that every time we get together, we just argue and argue and argue until we have no energy left. And then there are those that it's more of a heated discussion that leads to new insights for both of us, okay? And those are the kinds of people that you can have an antagonistic relationship with and come out ahead, both of you, because you've both learned something, you've both seen a new truth, you both have something new to think about, even if you never agree, ever. But at least you've made progress, okay? Now, in the quad, the relationships that go on the two horizontal ones here, between those elements, and quad, do this in black and maybe that'll look a little bit better. There we go, there's the quad. And here's these two relationships that are horizontal. Those are companion relationships. And companion relationships are such that a positive companion relationship is when I do something without even thinking about the other guy, I have a positive fallout on him. Like, for example, suppose I work at a place and I throw out in the trash every time some styrofoam boxes that things are packed in. And the guy next door, he hasn't got a lot of money, and his kid likes to make forts out of the styrofoam boxes. So he comes over and says, hey, you threw those out, can I have them? I say, sure. He takes them and he helps his kid build a fort. Now that's a positive companion relationship because something good happened that wasn't intended directly to impact that person, but instead it just happened to impact that person. And that's where most friendships come from. So unlike people in real life where you're sparring all the time, or, and you're either, they're your sparring partner or you're the loyal opposition, or there's somebody you just hate and want to destroy, definite personality conflict. Here, you've got somebody that just being around them makes you feel better, or there's some tangible thing like those styrofoam boxes, or they know somebody who's always tagging around, and every time you see this person, that other person's with them that you really like, okay? That's a positive companion relationship because they bring something into your life that's positive that you wouldn't have had otherwise. But a negative companion relationship is when they do just the opposite. That's something that happens because of their normal activities without even thinking about you, just rubs you the wrong way, does something that upsets your plans. Inspector Clouseau is a good case of that, where he's not a bad guy and he's not intending to hurt anybody, but every time he's around, he trips and he falls into something and he destroys something and has a negative impact that was never intended, never directed, but just by virtue of the fact that he is there in a relationship with you. And that is how you have a negative companion relationship. And the final part of this quad, so it would seem at first, is that if we have these verticals, which are dependencies. So notice we have dynamic, which are conflicting, and then we have companion, which are like friendships or people that you just don't like around because it's always going to be bad. You have the same thing with these dependencies, and the dependencies are vertical. And what that means is in a positive dependency, it's like, I'm okay, you're okay, together, we're terrific, okay? Where each of you is self-sufficient and fine and don't have any problems, but when you come together, your skills blend and you're greater than the sum of your parts. Now that's basically a positive dependency, okay? And that's what most intimate relationships are based on. You have the friendship quality of a positive companion relationship, and you have a positive dynamic. So when you fight, you're not really hurting each other, you're disagreeing, and from it comes a new idea, like, I don't want to live here, I don't want to live there, I want to live this place. Argue, argue, argue. Well, you know what you said about the place you wanted to live? Well, that's over here at this other place. And you know what you said about that place you wanted to live? Well, that's over here at the same place. Well, why don't we just not go to those two places and go to this third place, okay? That is how the best relationships work. They're positive down the line. Positive dependency. Negative dependency, I am nothing without my other half. If they leave me, I can't continue. I won't exist. I'll kill myself. I can't function. When they go to work, I just have to lay there in bed until they come back because I just can't function on my own. I need them. And if the other person feels the same way, then you have a codependency, okay? And codependency is where each one requires the other to feel complete, as opposed to feeling something greater than complete by being with the soulmate that extends you beyond your normal capability, but you're fine as you are. Okay, now you see that in characters all the time. So now if we bring up the Dramatica chart here, and Jim has got it all prepared for us. Thank you, Jim.
Mm-hmm.
Jim is my hero and savior. I pray to him 3 times a week.
All right.
I face Hollywood on a little carpet. No, I make all these terrible religious jokes. Please, nobody stone me or shoot me or anything. Anyway.
Okay, 1 second. All right.
Soon. And there. Are we
Okay.
live? Oh, good. Okay, so if you look here, you can see the same relationships in the upper right-hand corner where it says dynamic, companion, and dependent, just like I described. But it really doesn't tell you which one's negative or positive because it doesn't know, because we never worked that part of the theory out. So for all you theory bums out there who really want something to do with your time, figure out how we can tell from input given us by an author which one's going to be positive or negative, because it probably has something to do with subatomic spin, you know, left and right strangeness or something. I don't know, you know, but I can tell you that it's working in the dynamic part of the model. And that's the dynamic model is where I've done some preliminary work to stake out some ground, but it's where I'm not going to complete the work. So you want to figure that thing out about which one's positive or negative, you have to start working on the dynamic model. Yeah.
Do you have a direction? Is there like a vector to any of those? Or is they just...
To these, no, they're not really vectors. They're just relationships at this level. There are many vectors involved, but these are not they. These are just simple linear relationships between the two. Now, Jim on the over left-hand side, if you will take the influence character, one of them, and put them someplace on the chart of your choice. Now, when you do that, you see that the chart has shifted around. And what it's doing with you is telling you that that character is going to have this kind of relationship with the square to his right, the square that's diagonal to him, and the square below. So if you were building characters with a cast of 20 different characters and you wanted to assign just a few elements to each, not archetypes, you just wanted to say, these aren't reason characters or something, but they're spread out differently among your various players, then you could take those relationships and determine where you wanted to put each of the other characters based on how you wanted them to relate to this first character. Now, a lot of times in Dramatica, people will assign the elements that they want, and they'll say, I want this character to represent pursuit, and I want this one to be avoidance, and I want this character to be this or that. And then you say, now, how do they relate, having done that? Organic, if you say, I have a character here who is pursuit. How do I want him to relate to, Joe, to relate to Sally? Why I want them in conflict. I want them in a companion relationship. I want them in a dependent relationship. And then you can take the other one, let's take the IC, and put them in each of those positions in turn, one and then the other and the other. And as you put them in the same quad, you can see now they're in a conflicting relationship, a dynamic relationship. Could be positive or negative. But then if we shift them up and put them in as a companion, it could be a positive or negative companion relationship, but it changes the nature of the relationship. So it's no longer sparring or driving each other into the ground. Now it's having a positive or negative fallout. That's the kind of relationship they have. And then you can put in the final one, which is dependency, and that means that either they really work well together, quite fine by themselves, and they're greater than the sum of their parts, or that they just don't think that they are functional at all without the other person. Now, here's a secret of a quad. Let's go back to the board here for a second. Thank you, Jim, for that. Made it a lot easier to explain. Now, here's the problem that you run into, which is Dramatica, because it's a knowledge-based system of the K, T, and A, and D, the knowledge, the thought, the ability, the desire, and there's a sea shanty in there somewhere, I'm sure. Anyway, but with that relationship definition, it's based on hard relationships. And there are many ways that the theory could have been made manifest, could have been visualized, could have been organized, because there could be a T-based system or a desire-based system or an ability-based system, and it would alter the way things worked. However, because it's a K-based system, you see what you see over there. And that means that everything's looked at objectively. Like, this is the objective view. We're going to stand back and see story structure completely objectively. Meaning that in the dynamic part of the model, there's still work to be done on the subjective nature of story structure. And here's one example of it. Suppose you have a quad, and you have two characters, a little brother and a big brother. Well, you put them in a position in Dramatic and say, big brother's up here, and little brother's over here. So clearly they're in a companion relationship where he's having a positive companion relationship and he is having the same positive companion relationship. And whoever's down here, they're having a negative one because there's got to be one of each. And that's how I want to set it up. How it works objectively. It's not what's working in the heads of these characters. Now, here's the key. Little brother sees himself in a positive companion relationship, positive, with big brother. Big brother sees little brother down here in a negative dependency. He thinks little brother is tagging along, and he's nothing without him. Big brother says, you know, he hasn't got a life of his own. Get a life, you know. You're just tagging along, and you're bugging me, and I find this negative. Okay. Here, Dramatica says that there's one positive relationship and one negative relationship, and they're the same. How can it be that two characters can see a relationship differently? Because this is subjective. This is the subjective relationships inside a quad, and they're inside every quad of elements. Crackerjack has these subjective relationships as well as the objective ones. I'll tell you how and why that works in a second, but there's something very interesting. What happens if little brother is seen as negative by him, and little brother sees a positive relationship over here? What kind of a relationship do they end up having? Quads, again, the simple quad, every single one of them works like this. So many different layers of truth, depending on what you want to do. Positive times negative. There's your vectors, right there that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Okay, now when you put your vector together, you end up with a negative dynamic relationship, meaning they end up pounding each other to the ground. Little brother gets his feelings hurt all the time. Big brother feels that he's just totally being attacked and his life is being ruined by little brother, and they end up in a negative dynamic relationship, subjectively. But you'll never see that in Dramatica. You'll never see it in the Dramatica chart, not Dramatica of today. That's in the theory, but it's not in the software, because the software is all based on a visualization of knowledge base, which requires the objective view, which is the look from the outside. And that works, and here's why it works. Because the objective view, when you're looking at character elements, a moment, say that we're looking at archetypes. Well, let me just go down a little bit for that. Okay, for archetypes, you're going to have like a protagonist here and an antagonist there, for example. And as a result of it, they're always going to be in conflict. And doing their function, their objective function, they're objective characters. Remember, in Dramatica, there's two kinds of characters, objective characters and subjective characters. Subjective characters are like the main character and the influence character. The main character is a point of view. The influence character is a point of view. The points of view in Dramatica are I, you, we, and they. Make it at the top of the screen. Yeah, I think it does. Yeah. I, you, we, and they. I is the main character right here. That's the main character. You, the main character, is looking at the person that sees things philosophically different than they. That's the influence character. What's the relationship between us, okay, between main and influence? And there's where you have sort of that private relationship that isn't based on structure. It's based on point of view, okay? And then there's this they perspective. So 3/4 of Dramatica, 1, 2, 3, 3/4 of Dramatica is all about those two characters. That's it. All the other characters in your story, they're in here. They're objective characters, because what you're saying basically in Dramatica is that there's all these 64 elements that are the smallest parts of ourselves that we can see while we're still looking up at the big picture and seeing the big broad stroke top level situation, fixed attitude. What's my situation? What's my attitude? What kind of activities are I involved in? What kind of manipulations are going on around me? Okay, when you're looking at yourself like that, the smallest pieces you can see, big picture, having a disappear is the elements at the bottom. And that's where the objective characters are built. So all the archetypes, okay, live here in this 1/4 of Dramatica. And that's when Jim was showing you that chart a little earlier. That is going to be in the objective story. Wherever the objective story is, those are the elements that are going to make up those characters, and that you're going to be making these choices about as to how they relate. So from an objective standpoint, because they're seen by their functions, the objective characters, the archetypes, even if they're individual elements, complex characters, and you're just making them out of little elements, okay, they're still going to be seen like this. Little brother, big brother, they're in this positive. Okay, that's subjectively, that's how they act. But what if you get inside it and say, we don't just have a main character and influence and what's going on with them. What if you have the story within the story? What's going on between the big brother and little brother? In other words, it's almost like big brother and little brother are each main characters in their own narratives within the quad. And this is the subjective story right here. Okay. So that would leave everything over here, would be the objective story. Everything would be in the 4th area for the movie within the movie, the story within the story, the narrative within the narrative. So now instead of doing the big narrative of that, why is that important? Because in real life, we are not always the main character of the big narrative everybody's involved in, but each one of us is the main character of our own personal narrative. And in real life, which is where the dynamic model is going to help us so much, is in personal problem solving and interpersonal relationships in the real world. And when we are the main character of our own narrative, all the tension in the world that we feel is the dissonance created between what is right for us in our personal narrative and what we're obligated to do as an objective character in a larger narrative in which other people are involved. All suffering, all angst, all tension is created by the differential between what's right for us and what's right in the larger narrative. And that's what stories generally seek to explore in terms of the main character is, this is my personal narrative, and this is what's putting pressure on it philosophically. And as a result of that, all these other people are trying to achieve that. And depending on how I choose as main character to either change or remain steadfast, that will determine whether success is achieved or not, and also whether happiness is achieved or not, regardless of success. So there's quite a lot going on right there. But when you get down into the quad, this is a useful way to start talking about how those elements relate and go the next level deeper and say, if we wanted to explore in a series, arching story here, but you wanted to see what's going on inside the series or a sequel or something, you could then see by these elements the kind of tensions that's created and the resultant vectors, the subjective story within the quad that describes that. But there's something else. I will simplify this chart and we'll give you the something else up here. And this is kind of weird and wonderful, like me. Okay, what we have in this, not too much laughter now. Okay, what we have when we're looking at this big brother and little brother, okay, come on, boo-boo, little brother down here. Okay, Yogi. All right. What's going on in those relationships holds true with the positive and the negative and creating the resultant negative until something weird happens. There's not just relationships in the quad, there's 4. Oh, I gave it away. Okay, here in the quad, there's this one last kind of relationship, which each item could be seen as independent, or they could all be seen as a collective. All right, that's another kind of relationship that exists within a quad. It's the only remaining relationship after you've covered both of these, both of those, and both of those. By the time you've done the dynamic and the companion and the dependent, then you have this, which is the component relationship. They're either a collective or they're independent units. And that's the trouble we have in this country. We don't know whether we should say, this is the United States or these are the United States. If you speak down south about it, it's going to be, these are the United States. If you speak up in New England, it's going to be, this is the United States. Fact is, it's really a little bit of each because there's states' rights, and every state has a right to do things that don't affect anything that goes across its border, and that's where the federal government is limited. So in one sense, it's one nation, but in another sense, it's really a bunch of little nation states that exist, and the only time that they limited, because that's the way it works. States have absolute power unless they do something that affects interaction with another state, and that's where the government has power, the national government, okay? But the national government can't go into a state and tell them how to do this or that unless it's violating something that is involved in interstate commerce or people who are traveling from one state to another and recognizing documents or not, or something like that. That's where the federal government can put down its thumb because it affects relationships among the states, and that's the only place they have power. Do this, suppose in this situation, all of a sudden there's a bully out here, BU, bully, okay? And the bully comes into the picture and threatens the little brother. Well, all of a sudden now, big brother sees his family, his little brother being threatened, and suddenly little brother is positive relationship with him, and all attention of both is put on the bully because they have become a family. However, they go back to the house after the bully attack, and that's turned it to a positive. They go back to the house after the bully attack, and they find that they still don't want to be around each other, and mom and dad are pretty much the same. They have their own beds, they have their own rooms, they do their own thing, they don't really talk. Everybody's got their own television, their own mobile device, they sit and they use them. They don't converse, they don't have dinner around the table. They are independents. They are not a family under those circumstances. And under those conditions, then each one does what he wants, and the others don't care as long as it doesn't negatively impact them, like a negative companion relationship or a negative dependency or a negative dynamic. As long as it's all kept positive, stay out of my hair, I'll stay out of yours. And those are also relationships that exist in every single quad. You don't have to just do it at character elements. You can do it between situation and fixed attitude and activity and manipulation. You can see these same kinds of relationships and companions at all levels. But the Dramatica software only focuses on it at the character level, and it doesn't give you any of the subjective stuff because that's not in line with the objective view that Dramatica takes for creating a structure about the big picture and the one personal narrative of the main character that is in conflict with that narrative for the big picture that everybody else is involved in. So anyway, that's an extension of it there. Now, at this point, are there any questions from anybody in the room? We covered a lot of ground. Has anything jumped out that you really want to know more about or wish you didn't know that much about?
Is the individual one positive implied that the overall one's negative?
No, not necessarily. What's intriguing about what you're saying there, interesting thing is that if you look at these relationships, what have you got? You've got three relationships, and they are the equivalent of sine and cosine, okay, and secant and cosecant and tangent and cotangent. Those are those three relationships. And you know what the others are? I don't either, because in order to describe them, this thing, which sort of violates keeping it inside the thing, because now you're talking about a force that comes from outside that changes it to be either independent or flips its state, its binary state from independent to family, you know, which you can see all the time in experiments with light and subatomic particles and tachyons and all this stuff, and, you know, having this synchronicity where you flip one and another one flips that's separated by more distance than the speed of light could travel, you know, and it's flipped when this, you know, that kind of synchronicity. All that stuff is happening. It's not explained by standard math. It's a very complex theory that they're trying to figure out why it does it. But in reality, what we see is it's just that all this stuff that we're looking at is put into the realm of the imaginary number in trigonometry, okay? So as long as you're dealing with things in the real number, which can carry it up to here, you could see these individual points, and you can see these relationships. You're dealing with a real number system. But anything that talks about this other force that comes from outside the system you're studying is in the realm of the imaginary number, okay? And so my feeling is that in the early days, Chris and I talked about that if we ever wanted to fully describe what a quad could do, you know, oh, look what this quad can do. It sounds like a kid's cartoon from Christmas. Why this quad can, okay. If you do that, you're going to need quadranometry. I have no idea what that is. I'm not a mathematician. I'm a pattern recognizer. First class, okay? Anyway, the thing is that when you recognize these patterns, you can see that if trigonometry is a direct relationship with those, and it really is talking about those in that case becomes whether you're going clockwise or counterclockwise. It's really all it is. So you basically have these different kinds of waveforms. And like we often talk about with Dramatica, is that when you're looking at a quad and you're rotating through time, and we're going to do that in a little bit, we're going to move through time in the quad, 1, 2, 3, 4, and change the order. But when you're rotating, you're going around and around and around. It looks like a circle, okay? Nothing's happening. You're looking like a circle. But if you look at it from the side, it's like a sine wave, okay? It could be a cosine. We really can't tell because we have no frame of reference, okay? So when you look at it from the side, it looks like that. But in reality, it's doing this because you have one more level of space and it's a slinky. It's a helix, okay? My God, it's a helix. So when we say that Dramatica is a quad helix, there's a reason for that. The helices, the double helix, can be seen in the 3D model. When you look at it, it's actually two helices. Well, two helixes, which it's a double helix, okay? Two helices. And when you then rotating those two helices, that's when you end up with two dynamic helices, a double helix of dynamics with the structure. And that double helix of dynamics is causing the structure to flip. But at the same time, the structure, just like water and earth, the structure is causing the dynamics to flow around it and altering the dynamics as well. We can't see that. We don't even know what happens yet because we haven't a dynamic model. But I can tell you that's what's going on because of the relationship between going this way or this way is a positive or negative, and you're going to have the sine, the cosine, the secant, the cosine, the tangent, the cotangent, and then you're going to have this other relationship in the imaginary numbers area to be described if you had quadranometry as a helix moving through this extra dimension, this dimension, a dimension of time. Okay, picture, if you will. We have entered a dimension of time. And once again, we end up with self-awareness. The mind is a machine made of time. Every gear and pulley is a process, not an object. It's one level above dealing with just items. You deal with processes of the mind, and it's how one process relates to another process. There's nothing tangible there. There's nothing physical there. It's the order in which you go through things that will determine what the experience is for the mind. If you go through each one of these four items in a particular order, having one kind of experience. If you go through another order, you have another kind of experience. There's one last thing I want to show you about the inside of the quad in terms of subjective reality and how it relates to objective reality of Dramatica. This is what Chris and I did quite a while ago, is that if you have a quad and you want to say, well, what kind of, where's the attention focused of a character sitting on this element, that element right there? That's where the character is. And he's looking at these other three characters who represent these elements, and he wants to see how they relate. There's two ways he can do it. He can do it by saying, how does that other character relate to me? How does that character relate to me? And how does that character relate to me? Which creates what we call, three fingers there, a splay, because they splay out. Splay. Okay. And that's the subjective, S-U-B-J, view, because the character is saying, I'm part of the picture. I have this relationship. How is that relationship with this character? How's that relationship with this character? And they think at that point, they understand how the whole quad works. But do they? No, because they never stop to consider how does this character relate to that one? How does this one relate to that one? It leaves parts of it unexplored. So it's not truly objective. Okay. So that's a splay. But the other way, and I'll just actually put it next to it here, right there. Okay. This is going to be another way of looking at it, is if you have a character sitting here and he's looking at three other characters just as before. Okay. Only he's now considering how they relate to each other. How does this character relate to that character? How does that character relate to this character? And now you've got all the possible relationships among those other characters, and he believes he's being objective because he's standing outside it and saying, how do they relate to one another? But as we all know, the observer affects the observation. So this guy's not really got an objective view. It's a pseudo-objective view, okay? And so this is called a display. Display, because he's looking at a display, okay? So that's a way to remember the names, just little simple mnemonics there. Aristotle used to do that. He'd go around, he'd go to a tree and then deliver this part of a speech, or Socrates or Plato. Fact is, whoever it was used those different points as mnemonic devices so that they could remember what they wanted to talk about. And yet, after having studied it, I have no mnemonic device to help me remember which of the Greek philosophers did it. How's that for irony? Okay, so anyway, display and display, the two ways that somebody inside a quad could be looking at how they relate to the other characters. When in reality, of course, we know that they are actually related like that, like that, like that, like that, like that, like that, and as independent points, and also like that if we had quadranometry to describe it. All right. So that pretty much covers that part of it. Now, at this point, does anybody need to take a break? Does anybody need to ask a question? Does anybody need to cry into their computer?
That's one more question.
Yeah.
So earlier when you put, or even with these quads, do you have you identified a relationship between the top and the bottom, the same way you have the left and the right?
These guys that they would look at, this would be a, yeah, you would end up looking at that as a dependent relationship. This would be a companion relationship.
Oh, no, I mean just the, you know, how you identify states and processes and internal and external?
Oh, well, again, that only works at the top level of quad. And let me tell you a little bit about that. That's a good question, because I actually wanted to work on it somewhere, and you've given me the perfect opportunity. You must tell people I did not pay you to do this. Okay.
Definitely not getting paid.
Definitely not. You're paying a price, though. Okay. You got to be here. Everybody else can sort of like just slowly close the computer and back away slowly, you know. Anyway, but okay. So the thing is that in terms of the relationships at the top level, a lot of people probably think this, although strangely enough, in 25 years, nobody's ever asked me this. Situation, how come past, present, how things are changing or progress, and future are what you divide situation in? Why don't you divide it into the situation that that somebody else is in, the situation that I'm in, the situation that, why don't you do that? Or you get down to the level below that and you've got, let me see, I need my reading glasses. Okay, manipulation, okay. Developing a plan, conceiving of an idea, playing a role, changing one's nature, and then you look under changing one's nature, responsibility, obligation, commitment, you know, and these are things when you say, what does that have to do with changing one's nature? Well, here's the problem. Because it's a helix, you know, and we can talk all day about why it's a helix, but because it's a helix, every time you go down a level, it's twisting the meaning a little, okay? And you go down another level, and it twists it again. So if it's external and internal state and process at the top, it's something else completely when you get down to the next level, and something else completely when you get down below that. But it also shifts laterally because it's a helix. So when you're moving, you know, through the model sort of at a tangent and going down through it instead of straight down through the model, you're going to find that it drifts with lateral meaning as well. And finding the terms that fit and were true to the quad and had the right amount of drift to account for the helical shift, you know, was astoundingly difficult. And I actually have no idea how we managed to pull it off. It was pretty hard. That's why the things aren't just as simple as saying, okay, we're going to take rocks of different sizes, or blue, green, red, and okay, there's another one for you. What if you have blue and green and red? What's the fourth one? You know, you got blue and green and red. You could put them in positions depending on what you want. And what's going to be the fourth one over here? It's going to be the intensity, or the, you know, the level of lightness or brightness, luminosity. That would be the other one over here. So that, again, four things, you end up with three primary colors. Okay, that's always going to make that group. So it happens over and over again. So one of the interesting things is you have to look for quads everywhere. If you don't have a quad everywhere, you're missing something. I pointed this out the other day. He figured this out for himself. It was pretty cool. He says you're at the top level and you go down to the next level. Oh, that's a horrible rectangle. And you go down to the next level, and then you go down the next one below that. And you've got put assigned items to this. What would be the KTAD of it? And he said, I believe it's this. And he was absolutely right. This is the K, okay, this is the A, this is the T, and this is the D in the vertical quad of the structure. Meaning the D desires, where you end up with character motivations, what drives characters, makes a lot of sense. T, which is thought, has to do with value standards and comparing one value against another. A, ability, certainly that fits right in with plot where you'd expect it to. And knowledge is determining where the problem resides in which of those 4 areas. Makes perfect sense, but you'll notice that here's a dynamic pair and here's a dynamic pair, and they're separated, and you could actually take those 4 items and reconstitute them into a quad of sorts. So that you would have, in this area where K is, all you'd have is 4 items. And then over here where A is, then you're going to have 16 items. Okay, and so on. And then you get down to where you have your 64 items. So that would be the way you could see in a flat projection how the vertical chart would actually lay out. Not so much like that, where things are on the wall chart, where they're all 4 equals and they go all the way down to the elements. But basically you'd have all the top items here, all the elements at the bottom. Now, why aren't all the elements at the bottom? Because the shift is such that by the time you get to the 4th level, it starts to break apart. And here's why. This is really kind of way out there. I swear we're getting back to writing here at some point, to creating a story. But the thing is that it's like looking through filters. You look through 3 levels. By the time you get down to the 4th level, everything's distorted. And like Chris has often said, you create a fish tank here, okay? And in this fish tank, you put a stick, and it looks like it's bent at the water's surface, and you don't know whether that bending that occurs, okay, is bending because it's a bent stick or because you're seeing refraction, and that's why you have to move all the way around. You have to look things through 4 sides. That's kind of that filter effect. And because of the cumulative effect of that helical shift in meaning, that means they're not all internal, external state and process all the way down to the bottom. Okay, by the time you get to the bottom, you would think that the elements would all be the same, and they are. 64 elements, because each one is really like a different perspective on the same thing. Situation or universe is looking at what does everything look at as deeply as I can see from the standpoint of a fixed state. Okay, what's everything look like as deeply as I can see if I think of it as a process? Okay, that's what activity is. If I think of everything in terms of an attitude, what's the whole visible universe look like if I go down to the bottom of this narrative and look at it in terms of fixed attitude or a manner of thinking, and you get to the bottom? Each one is a different set of filters, but you're looking at the same thing. So you see the same elements, but effect changes which ones are connected. It breaks them down into binary level. So sort of like little bipolar molecules of 2 items. You'll find that what originally was this one with this one, now that's no longer going to be paired with it, and maybe this one or something from over here is paired with this one because of the flip in another class. So you'll notice the element names are the same, but the pairs relationships are changing. And that's what happens. That's where it begins to break down, because it's not all of a sudden you get to 4 levels and you can't see another level beyond it without the top. It's like it begins to fade out, or it begins to get so distorted that you can't see the truth at that level, and reality breaks out back into the realm of the imaginary number at that lower level. So that's actually what's happening in terms of those relationships and with those elements. And people do occasionally ask about why the elements shift those relationships, and that's the beginning of reality, the laws of physics, the laws of psychology beginning to fail at that point, because the quads can't maintain themselves and the molecules are breaking up. It's starting to disintegrate awareness, okay, at that level, and breaking it down into binary pairs. Now, all this stuff I've talked about, the funniest thing to me and say, I don't know, I looked at Dramatica and I looked at these quads, what good is a binary system? What? They're saying, well, look, you've got something and it's opposite right next to it, faith and disbelief. It's all binaries. You just put a bunch of binaries in a bunch of little boxes. What good is that? What good is that going to do me? Well, them, it's not going to do me any good at all. Go away. Yeah, sometimes I do answer that way and I lose a potential sale. But if I say, oh, well, think of this, and oh gosh, you should consider that these points all have to be in there. And the fact that the relationship just shows that tension can be built and something like that. So if I give them that kind of a cock and bull story, at that point, then they say, well, I'll try it. And then, of course, I have to refund it next week, which is a pain in the ass. But
is there a way they're plotted? Is there a pattern to how the 256 because there's 64
Yeah.
elements.
Yeah. You mean which one goes in which thing, broken up which way? Well, actually, there's a story about that too, and I'll give it to you. Is that we had them all set up, and we were about to go to the Gold Master, which was the final master of the software before we ran all our copies. And at least in those days, there were no downloadable versions of anything, so it was just you got it on a CD, and then you sent it off and had it duplicated 1,000, 2,000, 10,000 CDs. Okay, so it was important. Once you get to Gold Master, you don't change nothing. So we're like just days away from this, and I was looking at it, I said, uh-oh. We considered all of the things in breaking it down, but we never considered that by the time you get through 4 levels down, the helix moves 1 level over. It rotates 1 level around, 90 degrees. So I had to go into Steve, and I had to say, who was here earlier at the beginning of the evening, I said to Steve, I know you've got all these tables and charts and everything in there, but we've got it broken down all the way. We have to take, by the time we get to the element level, just the elements, we have to shift them over 90 degrees all the way around the chart. And as the story goes, as Steve would relate it, he said that everything worked pretty good, and it was really making the stories seem like this was very predictive of what happened. And then we put in that shift of 90 degrees, and it just totally clicked. At that point, it was spot on, okay? But that's because if you put any group of 4 things together and you don't account for them being a valid quad, that one out of left field, that's the movement that's out of left field that I almost forgot to apply, was the shift that's going to occur at the bottom. And why is that shift there? Because getting back to that trigonometry, around and around and around, but what's really happening is that you're going like this, and by the time you've made 1 trip around and you're just above where you were, you're really going full spiral, not full circle, and you are 1/4 of the way to creating a vertical quad, because the mind works at 90 degrees to itself. It doesn't work linearly, okay? Then you go around another time, and you are, again, another 1/4 up on this vertical quad. You've now got 1 level and 2 levels of the vertical quad, 2 points on a vertical quad. You go around the 3rd time, you've got the 3rd point, 3/4 of the way, and you go around the 4th time, and you've got the 4th point, and then at that point, you have fully explored it. And this is what happens when you go with signposts and journeys. This is what's happened when you go from the top of the chart to the bottom. But here's what the mind does. The mind doesn't like that. The mind doesn't like that extra dimension. That's why trigonometry is been so successful, because nobody needs quadranometry, because that takes care of all this slop. Imaginary numbers is where all that slop goes. It's putting it under the mathematical carpet, okay? So what's really happening, though, is even though this is rising, we don't do the rise. And then we go around again, and we don't do the rise. And then we go around again, we don't do the rise. And where do we put the rise? Well, by the time we go around the 4th time, stuff that has to go somewhere, because there's no place left to go on the quad. It down, pushed it down, and now it all has to go into this one. And what do you end up with? Gravity, fire, time, plasma, the 4th thing that's out of shape, okay? That is because it gets all of that slop over, because we want to see everything nice and neat and flattened out like a flat chart that makes total sense. And in order to do that, we're hiding the fact that it's really not exactly that. It's always moving, always shifting, always drifting. But if we do it this way, we can make a nice quad out of it and label each of the 4 places and create our relationships. But that other thing is going to have to pick up all the slack, because we've been pretending it doesn't exist, okay? Somebody's got to pay the piper, and it's always the guy in the left field. Yeah.
So is there a universal quad that you use to check all the rest against?
Well, it's not a universal quad per se. It's just, the universal quad looks like this. That's it right there. The rest is understanding what it means, okay? So when we've talked about all the things we've talked about that it could just be a cubby, or it could be knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. It could be mass, energy, space, and time, or any of those other 4 things. And then we have these pair relationships. And then we've got the subjective things that are going on with displays and the displays. And you do all that. If all of them function within a quad, you got yourself a valid quad. And that's what you test it against. It has to work with all of them. If one of them doesn't work, you're off somewhere, okay? And that's really what the process of story forming is about. The process of story forming is to make choices until you get down to the one that best represents something that functions like a quad at every level and every direction for every element of your story. And then you have a story that is a complete argument, because everything works according to quad sense, okay? instead of nonsense, or so anyway, that's the way that works. And just for fun, we're about to move into a whole new realm. Okay, so if you have more questions about this, go ahead and ask them, because we're moving out of space, and for a while we're going to move into time.
I don't know anything about trigonometry, but I don't remember anything about it. Trigonometry is based on 3 of something.
It actually is based on quadrants, and it creates 3 kinds of patterns that come out of moving around the quadrant in one direction or another, and then the z-axis, and like it's got extra space. I was never that good at math because I kept saying bullshit, and every time I would study this stuff, and it's funny, I went back and I took trigonometry again in college about 5 years after we did Dramatica, because I figured maybe I should know some of this stuff, So I went out and took it, and the first time I took it, I got an A when I was in high school, and when I went back and took it, I got a C, because I didn't buy into any of it anymore, because there was more to it than that. I wish I knew more math, because good old Isaac Newton invented calculus, because trigonometry wasn't enough for him, I was always hoping I'd figure out a way, but I just don't have the math skills.
The equation that combines the trigonometry and imaginary numbers is called Euler's
Okay.
equation. And
Okay. Yeah, somebody's mentioned that to me. Yeah. Yeah, it's a transform.
Yeah. It actually, they usually they do your spiral with the real number line and the imaginary number line intersecting.
Right. So somewhere, all that math that's out there probably can explain some of what's going on here. But I'm a pattern recognizer and a modeler, conceptual modeler, not a mathematician. This is where you would say, okay, I've had fun with my tinker toys and created this Dramatica thing. Now bring in the mathematicians to describe what happened. Okay. And that's what I hope someday somebody will do, because sure ain't my forte. Or 3-tay with an imaginary tay.
Do you want to take like a 5-minute?
5-minute break. Okay, everybody out there who's been hanging on every word. Anybody out there still?
Yeah, there's still.
Yeah, there's 1 or 2 people that are into self-abuse. Okay, so yeah, go ahead, take a restroom break, grab yourself some water, and we'll convene here in another 5 minutes.
That's gonna keep going.
Yeah, broadcast will keep going, so you can steer at this. Maybe we can make shadow puppets or something. I don't know. We got to give them something to look at. What there, that's what we're going to talk about next. You can look at that, see if you can figure out what that says. Yeah. So yeah, I can feel the math in it. I just don't know the math.
I mean, that's yours.
Oh, super.
I couldn't find the graph of it, but I can find it later. But you can see that, and if instead of using x, if you had radians, it would be pi r, based on the radius of the circle. So you have e, which is a transcendental number. You have I, which is an imaginary number, and then you have pi, which is all in the same equation with the cosine x and an imaginary number sine x.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's wonderful.
I think, and then topology.
Oh yes, I love topology.
Yeah, so
topology is great. I mean, that's where.
That's what your work is.
Yeah.
Just reflecting on.
Yeah, topology is where an inner tube is equal to a coffee cup.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. That's pretty cool stuff. Yeah. Yeah, that's neat. That's neat. Yeah. Thank you. That's great stuff. Somebody actually did a whole series of mathematical things. It's yeah, for those I'll just put this up on the board. There's a special place for people who have no life, and it is called storymind.com/Dramatica. Spell it, Matica. Okay. Storymind.com/Dramatica. And it is so incomplete, but what it is a place where I've managed to stuff a few of the historic documents and some of the work other people have done. One person took the 64 elements of Dramatica and compared them to the 64 hexagrams of the I Ching and did one-to-one comparison. And then somebody, believe it or not, named Noah, N-O-A, okay, took the archetypal characters and compared them to families of the hexagrams in the I Ching. And so I Noah's archetypes. I don't like that. Anyway, but that was really cool. And somebody else did a projection into multidimensional space of what a story form looked like. And I couldn't understand any of it, and therefore I published it because I thought it must be wonderful. So, so far nobody's complained that, you know, that it has any secret messages or anything.
So I read that actually about last week, I think.
You read that?
I did, yeah.
Oh my God.
And I noticed that it seems to correspond the best to the theme level.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't tell if that's just because I can't understand how you came up with the bottom 256. And then
Well, have you got a question about that?
yeah, I don't know. Well, I mean, the closest chart I thought where someone else had gone through and done it for the I chain,
Oh, yeah.
where you have all the broken,
Mm-hmm.
you have all the sticks that are broken, and then you have all these names that get associated with them.
Well, the way we came up with the actual elements at the bottom level was not just by putting Post-it notes on a chart and seeing what families fell into which family and how they all seemed to come together and make some sort of sense. However, once we had done that, then we started following the KTAD pattern. And again, this is filler for those who happen to be hanging around and not going away from their computers or listening to us. But the way we came up with the equations is, the original equation was come up with, which was K over T equals AD. And the interesting thing about that is that it's not a math equation, it's a logic equation. And it basically means that when you consider K, or when you parse K in terms of T, is a way of looking at it. In other words, when you're thinking about knowledge, and you're making knowledge jump and do tricks, okay? When you're doing that with your thoughts, then it's equal to ability and desire. Now, it doesn't mean that it's actually equal. What it means, it has to remain in a balance with ability and desire. So that, how is that balance maintained? Well, basically, what it means is, this is almost like a motive force here. If ability is 0, then ability times desire, desirability is the resultant from that. Ability times desire is desirability. And when you multiply them out, if ability is 0 or desire is 0, there's 0 desirability. But for any situation in which both A and D are not 1, then you have a value. And that value determines the desirability factor. Now, is deductive logic right there. That's what that means, is deductive logic. So deductive logic, what does it have to do with desirability? Well, the fact is, where you're going to use your deductive logic to think about your finances or to try and determine what you ought to do to make up with your girlfriend, okay, that's desirability that determines that. So this is how the mind works. The emotions over here are actually affecting where one applies one's logic and for how long and with what intensity, to the exclusion of other things, how long you stick with it. It's all part of a big equation, but people tend to think, well, I'm thinking about it logically, so everything I'm doing is logical. They're forgetting about the fact that they're doing it because they picked that thing to think logically about instead of something else. And this is the real equation of the mind up here. So that is the functionality of that equation. But there's actually, it would seem there were 8 equations, because the equations that you would have in the model, remember K over T is in balance with A and D. So if you write it as K over T equals AD as a logical equation, the fact is you can then do T over K equals AD, and then you've done both of those, and then you could have K over A equals DT, and then you could have A over K equals DT. All combinations, all permutations actually, are valid, and they each equal a different kind of mental processing. If this is deduction, then you have induction and production and reduction, and all kinds of things are happening, but you only get through 8 of them. But then here's the interesting part, because it's not a math equation, the order makes a difference. So it's not just over AD. Here's another equation that is different, K over T equals DA, okay? Because, and motivation is not the same if you think about point A and then think about point B, as if you think about point B and then think about point A. In other words, this retrograde and anterograde interference with our motivational map, okay, due to which one we considered first. That's why first impressions are important. That's why, you filter through experience so that you don't see something the same way if you've seen something else first. Seeing the second thing, you're then going to think differently about what you saw in the first place. But a different order has a different conclusion. So you end up with, and here's why it's 90 degrees. I was thinking about this on the way over. I thought, I hope there's an opportunity to share this part because it's just so cool. Like Arch remarks, this is wonderful. I like that. Okay, so here you have the items. Here you have the two equations. 8 variations until you do this, and there's 16. So the equations are not the dynamic model. The dynamic model is determining whether you're looking at it this way or this way. That's why the dynamic model is 90 degrees from the structural model. It's just not a separate piece that's sitting next to it, that's operating it. Over here, in this direction, this is what we're looking at in terms of the 16 equations existing. But the fact that it's not 8 equations and it's 16, and it could be either one of these, the dA or the AD, that is actually the dynamic model operating at 90 degrees logically because it's actually affecting the operations. It's nonlinear in the sense that as a result of this functions a certain way, and this goes in and changes some of the variables in their position to give them a different result. So it's kind of like a psychological nonlinear equation that's iterating in your mind, okay? And that's a bit how that, we'll get to that a little later. I'm going to show you a real cool thing called op quads, which actually show the operations that are applied to the quad. And I'm going to show you a little taste of it. The whole thing is proprietary knowledge. It's intellectual property. I can't show you all of it. I can show you this one little piece so you understand how it works, but not really with enough ability to recreate it, okay? So anyway, we're going to move on now to sequence very briefly here. Sequence is to look at temporal quads. We've talked about spatial quads. How's the relationship among everything? Now we're going to talk about temporal quads. So for temporal quads, you take a quad and you put in it 1, 2, 3, 4. Or in another quad, you may find that the order of things that they occur in the story would be 1, 2, 3, 4. Show up. This was one of the things that was most confusing to us when we had the chart, was that we were trying to figure out what the order was that things went through. And in some orders, like this one here, 1, 2, 3, 4, it creates a pattern like that. And in this order, it creates a pattern like this. Okay? And it could be oriented in a direction. You also get patterns like this. Or sideways, it could be like that. Okay? So you end up with these patterns that go through a quad. So we were finding that quads, the items we put in the quads, the name we selected for the quads, those processes of the mind that each of those items represents. Because remember, the chart isn't about things. Hope is not a thing. It's the process of hoping when you see it in the chart. Faith is not a thing. It's the process of believing. Okay, so this is how the chart works. There are the mental processes and how they relate to one another. The chart's just a map of how they hang if there's no angst, if everything's in order, if you're not responding to the outside world. What's the default set of how these things are arranged, default arrangement. Okay, so we looked at all these patterns and we're trying to figure out how the heck can we predict that? And we said, well, if it has this factor and this factor, then it's going to be an end pattern. No. If it's this factor and this factor, it's going to be a hairpin. Okay. Every time we did it, we were wrong. We couldn't figure it out. And so that's where I had that experience I talked about last week a little bit, is I went with my daughter to the Science Museum and Museum of Science and Industry over at Exposition Park while I was trying to figure out how we can understand the patterns. And there was this line of magnets, and it was like 21 of them. They were bar magnets, each on a little axis. And you could rotate one, and if you got just the right speed, it would rotate the next one. You got just the right speed to rotate the next until you get all 21 going just by rotating one. If you went too fast or too slow or too hard or too soft, it wouldn't work. So you had to get it just right. And as we did it, I realized, oh, it's not plotting time on the chart, it's twisting the chart around so that it falls out of time. It's the chart that's moving. It's not things moving on the chart. It's the chart moving itself that creates this. So what did that actually mean? Well, it meant that when we answered certain questions, you know, there's the dynamic questions about about like main character changed to steadfast, success, failure, good or bad, holistic or linear. You all know those questions. Those dynamic questions, there's a bias, and one of them positions it in relationship to the model. And then there are 4 more questions, which you don't have to answer all of because it can calculate ultimately, but the concern and the issue and the problem. And if you know those 4 things, then you know where it attaches to the chart. So the first one determines how are all the operations mixed up with one another, and the second one says, now it was bias and skew. So this was the bias. How are things mixed up in the dynamics? Okay. Then the skew is, how is that positioned in 3-dimensional space? How is that rotated relative to the model? Assuming the model is sitting over here, how is that rotated, this bias thing? And then at that point, where is it attached? Which is the top level and all the way down to the problem level at the element, all 4 levels. You answer those questions and you have enough to create a story form, because that's all you really need to know. All the other things are not secondary, but they're not these guys, these questions. This was one of the hardest things to come up with, were these, because the whole concept of the model moving and the things flipped and rotated because we are moving something to the back burner and using something else, or we're trying something in a different order. By the time you flip and rotate, every conceivable sequence of a quad can be achieved by flipping and rotating every order that could be of 1, 2, 3, 4, and every one of those patterns. We worked with this, and again, I don't know how the hell we did it. I know when I did it. It was just before I was supposed to finally go on vacation with my family up to the mountains, just before Christmas, or maybe it was in January, I don't remember. It was around winter, around Christmas, and I made plans for it, and I was just like totally destroyed by Dramatica. It was like, it made me so emotionally raw. It was such a big idea. I had to put my whole personality on the hard drive, and so pretty miserable. And then they said, well, you've got 2 weeks to figure this out, and if you don't figure it out, then we're just going to go with all the good information we have about stories, and we're not going to create a model. There'll be no story engine. Okay, 2 weeks. Had to cancel a trip with my family. I had to put in even more time when that had been my goal, is if I got to this point, I could leave. Well, now I had this other goal, and I had 2 weeks, and 2.5 years of effort hung on those 2 weeks. And so every day I would come in and I would try to figure out what are the questions. But at that point, we'd come so far along, and I had so much of this in my head, I was finally able to say, these are the questions. There's 4, and then there's this connector. And this is what the questions are, and this is how they work. And why don't you bring up this opquad, since we're right here right now. It says opquad in the email that I sent you, strangely enough. Okay, let's see. There is the opquads. Okay. And for you guys here, you just look at this. Those are the opquads. And you can get an idea of how that works. The battery doesn't work on this thing. It may last for a little while, but maybe you got some more rope if you want to hang yourself with it. I know I am. Okay, so
hold on.
yeah, we'll bring these up and you can take a look at them. Now that is right from the heart of, earlier we were talking with Steve before this started about the story engine. And I had to remind him, because it's been so long, 25 years, that we created a live engine that processed the way the mind did, which means that it made a difference whether you did A or D first in desirability. And it could only process in one direction, and you could never back out of a choice. It's not like today's Dramatica. And we went through it, and you would have to put in, answer each question, and after you answered each question, it would go to the next phase, and the next phase, and the next phase, until it finished, and when it finished, it gave you all of the results. Now, this particular chart here shows the operations of flipping, which are those little diagonal lines, and rotating, which are the clockwise and counterclockwise arrows. And then another one next to it, whether it says it's going to both or neither, which is taking in the children, which means when it flips or rotates, does it take just the one level or what's below it too? If it takes both or it takes neither, and what's above it. And then also in terms of space and time.
So can you repeat the both and neither?
Yeah, both and neither has to do with taking the children, whether it's taking things above it and below it, or whether it's taking just below it, whether it's taking neither, whether it's taking both. And again, it's a long time ago, I don't remember all these, but this is a sample page of 16 pages of operations that go into making this I think it's 16, that go into making this thing work. And this is just for a couple of the questions showing how it would move if certain choices were made. Things down below are like objective, objective class, subjective class, subjective class, and subjective objective class. And then there's the changing class and the fixed class. And then there's a positive and negative charges, double positive, double negative, and all kinds of stuff. But what's really intriguing is the very last row there of that particular chart is what we were talking about with the bias and the skew. It says that based on certain choices that you make in Dramatica, it will then change the way the previous operations relate to one another. It'll alter the way the operations relate to one another. So it's actually kind of like an extra level of iteration. It's almost as if you're iterating iterative equations, or a group of iterative equations, and you're iterating the way they work. The way I like to describe it is, and let's shift back to the board here now. They've had a chance to see it. You can probably hunt that up if you want on the internet. That's where that page comes from. It's available, but it's not very enabling, but it is intriguing. Anyway, that is the stuff that came out of those 2 weeks of work, was the ability to express that, which I then explained to Chris in terms of the psychology of story. He explained to Steve in terms of logic, and Steve put it into computer language and built an engine that was only 27K in size and did all the processing. But it was so slow in those days with the slow computers that Steve had the brilliant idea of taking all the results that were possible of this thing and turning them into a giant table. And if you turn it into a table, then there was no live processor anymore, which is fine because we're only using finite stories with only 4 levels and 4 dimensions side by side. Since we have a confined space, limited space, he was then able to create this table for all contingencies, which then allowed people to be able to back in and back out, because you could just say what's still available if you back out of this and where you can go from there, which you couldn't do with the live model. And even though it didn't mimic the mind as much in terms of having the order in which we experience things change the meaning, all possibilities of changed meaning were accounted for in his table, so it had the exact same results, and it was much faster on those computers. And so no Dramatica product has ever been released that has the actual live story engine in it, the one that we created. They all just have the table that was generated by all the possibilities of the story engine, and it relies on that and scans it. The live one was only used internally. We did a lot of testing on a lot of stories, and I don't have the copy. I think there's a copy floating around here somewhere, but they've moved through several offices. So it may very well be possible that all of the understanding of how that works and the actual engine that was built with extensive notes on why it was chosen to do this way may all be lost. And we have something that does magic and we don't know what. Okay, we've got a lot of preliminary work, obviously, but okay, so the operations that then flip things, it's kind of like this. If you picture the mind as having iterative equations, which are the processes that go through themselves and then go back because of their result and alter one of the variables within the process, then you have a bunch of these things that are doing that, iterative equations going around back and altering a variable in their process. Then you'll find that as they do this in a medium, okay, the result not only alters that, but collectively these results can go past and alter one of the constants, one of the operations. Okay, it can alter an operation, so it changes an operation or the order of the operation, so that no longer is it just an iterative equation iterating fractally, but it is being altered at the same time. Its result that comes out of here also goes over here and changes some of its operations or the order of the operations, the order in which they're applied. And this is how the model of Dramatica works. So it's not just fractal, it's like uber fractal, one dimension above normal fractal operations, which is why it was so hard for people to figure out when all they wanted to do was say, maybe if we just put in a couple more scenes and characters, the hero's journey will be good for everything. Yeah, but that's linear. That's just linear. It's sequential, okay? And this is all spatial. So we're talking about time here in the quad, and we're talking about that 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're talking about the flipping and the rotating of Dramatica. Well, here's how it works. There's 2 windups, we call them. There's the objective windup and the subjective windup, and the objective windup winds up around the objective story, beginning down at the problem level, and then flipping and rotating depending on the choices you've made in the objective story. And then there's the one that winds up around the main character. So again, it's kind of the differential between the main character's dynamics that come from his personal narrative, dealing with the dynamics that have adjusted and put in place all of the arrangements of the overall story. And the compatibility between the two creates the dissonance that is what stories are all about, trying to find who's going to break, the main character and change, or the overall story that will get in line with the main character who remains steadfast. What's going to happen? Okay, that's what it's really all about. We don't know initially which of those is going to happen first, the objective or the subjective. Either one can happen first, but when you make your choices in Dramatica, it determines which one's going to be first. And as a result of it, if I recall correctly, the one that is double whammied by having this is going to wind up in the objective story, but it's eventually going to wind up all the way to the top that affects all of the 4 classes. They have here 4. Okay, and then the main character is going to take this one that's already mixed up, so it doesn't look like this chart. It looks like a screwed up chart. Everything's out of place. Not everything, but most everything's out of place. And then it takes the main character and applies it to that mixed up chart and goes all the way to the top and screws it up a second time. So you're going to have the overall story and you're going to have the main character. Each has a wind-up. Okay, and those wind-ups represent how each one has previously to encountering each other adapted itself, so that the overall story has adapted itself in this way, has this pattern, and the main character has this pattern, and one of them gets applied first, and the other one gets applied to one that's already screwed up, so one of them's double screwed, and that's the one that's not going to convert because it's double screwed. You know, the one that's only single screwed, that's going to remain constant. The other one's going to have to get in line with it because it's doubly screwed up. Okay.
So that's the change one.
Yeah, that's it exactly. So which one goes first is due to some of the questions that you answer about the story, like in success and good and bad and stuff like that. It will determine which one is okay. Now here's the fun part. We talked about the 1, 2, 3, 4, and we're going to talk about something else that's the spatial equivalent of the sequence of 1, 2, 3, 4, and then we're going to apply it to this mixed up chart that I just showed you. So I'm going to get rid of that for just a moment. And I'm going to say that we did our 1, 2, 3, 4, which can tell you the order in which the items in any quad will be explored in the story. So if it says in 1, 2, 3, 4, that first you're going to do faith, and then you're going to do disbelief, and then you're going to do this, and then you're going to do that. Or if you're going to go through your signposts in a certain order, 1, 2, 3, 4, all that comes from the same 1, 2, 3, 4. In the original engine, it gave 1, 2, 3, 4 on every single freaking quad in the entire model, all the way down the bottom level, all the way up to the top, every quad, 1, 2, 3, 4, in the original live model. That's why it took so long to calculate.
Is that what Sandy was saying he liked last week?
He would like it if he could see it, but he can't see it because it's nowhere. It's only in that live model. And we decided not to include it in the tables because we thought that would make it too confusing for users to see what the order should be for every single quad and all that material. How are you ever going to write from that? Oh, well, now I want to talk about hope, so it's got to be the second position. But it's like, man, we should all be astrologers. This is crazy. Okay? So the thing is that we decided to suppress it and only put it where it had the most sequential, where the most sequential parts of the story were. We would let it out where at the type level, second level down, types. That's where plot is at the act level. That's why we get our signposts and journeys with numbers on them. And the plot sequence report, it talks about what's going to be explored in what order because it's giving that information for theme as well. So it's connecting the theme to the plot. That's about the only place that you really have it. And, but all of it's calculated, all of it's valuable because it's all projective. It can say, based on this motivation map in real life of this person, we can now look at any one of these quads we want to follow and project the order in which they're going to behave, the order in which they're going to take action. Because narrative is nothing more than individuals who look at their situation, say, this is what it is, I prefer it to be this way, how am I going to get there, okay? And then they act on that action plan, and that becomes their personal narrative. Now, the situation may or may not be receptive to that. So they do their thing, the situation's what it is, and as they come into conflict, that's what a narrative becomes in a Dramatica sense, is that bigger picture and how it's resisting their attempts to get from A to B and make things the way they want them to be, okay, resolve things. So when we looked at the 1, 2, 3, 4, and we see that wind-up can affect that order, we now look over here at the P, R, C, P. And I don't know what order we have. I guess it's P, R, CP. That makes sense. Anyway, now what PRCP means, see at the bottom is down here? I don't know,
Yeah.
do we have any of these things?
I mean, I can steering consultant.
Okay, where's which one?
It goes potential resistance.
Potential
No,
resistance.
no. Like you have.
Okay, potential resistance.
Yeah. And then currents at the bottom.
Okay, currents at the bottom,
And
powers
then
up
powers
here.
up there.
Okay, good enough. Okay, so this is a dramatic circuit. It's a psychological circuit, and it's talking about looking at psychology in terms of the potential, the resistance, the current, and the power or outcome. We used to sometimes call it PRCO, and we then ended up with PRCP, those two Ps, because the end of a scene should always create the potential for the next scene. That's the way it should work, because that's what trips the mind to continue considering. If we resolved everything after going through one process of a little mental circuit here, a little psychological circuit, we just stop. Okay, we're done. But a new potential is created. Okay, so this is going to be power or potential there. So potential resistance, current, and power, which becomes the potential to generate that power, moves it into the next quad to start the whole potential resistance again. So it's a cascading series of little circuits that run their course and then move it like a transistor onto the next quad for continued processing. Okay. Now you can do this potential. There's a bunch of horses running down a hill. Resistance. We cut to a scene of a wall made out of bricks, and we go, oh, and we see all these running horses. Then we see this wall of bricks, and then we see the current, which is in this case they would either smash into them or they would jump over the wall, and depending on how we want to play it, that's the current. And then the power becomes, what's the aftermath? Well, the aftermath could be now they're continuing to run past that and they're running right into where a bunch of children are playing. Or it could be that they all smash into the wall and there's all this dead meat, and now carnivores start coming out of the woods, wolves and things to eat the horses, and the town's just beyond the horizon. Now we've got a new thing that moves into another scene. You can show them in any order. You could start with the wall. You could start with the horses. You could do a little foreshadowing and start with what happens, what the activity is. Or you could actually show the end first and go through any order you want. As long as they're covered, it's a circuit. It's seen spatially. It's not talking about the order in which things happen. It's just talking about how things are perceived. Our horses running down a hill, is that potential or is that a resistance to something? It could be any of these things, or it could be the current. It's how it's going to be perceived, the same subject matter, whether it's a potential, resistance, power, or current. Last point on this is, if you take the 1, 2, 3, 4, I wonder how crazy we were to figure this stuff out, okay? If you take the 1, 2, 3, 4 quad, how about that for a way to make a chord? Okay, and then you go potential and resistance. No, wait a minute. Potential and resistance and current and power. Okay, that's what we're doing. Okay, so there's another way to make a chord. Okay, so did anybody ever see Kelly's Heroes with Donald Sutherland? And he says, "This is my dog impression." Woof, woof. He says, "This is my other dog impression." Woof, woof. Well, this is my other way of making a quad. All right, I love movies. Anyway, so 1, 2, 3, 4 and PRCP. Okay. Now picture the double windup I gave you before. Here's what happens. Chart you see on the wall. Chart you download on Dramatica. No tension. Everything's great. Everybody's zenning out. Okay. Yeah. Balance restored. Okay. All right. So we're sitting there feeling really, really good. And then we do a wind up based on the kind of tension you've chosen you want to have in your story, which is why you picked the answer to the questions the way you answered them is, I want this kind of tension in my story. I want to deal with these kinds of issues. I want to come out this way. I want to have to think about it this way. I want to have them, act that way. Okay. And so you make these choices. And when you do, then one of those things, either the main character or the objective story, will wind up. And after one wind up, depending on what other questions you chose, one of these will be plastered all over the chart. Same way on every single plot. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4 at the higher levels that contain quads within quads with quads. Everything gets the same pattern, all in the unmixed up position. But what's it being plastered over? Something that's already been screwed up by moving the position around in the quads. It describes how the choices that were made in the quad that wound it up alter the temporal processes of the mind, whether it's DA or AD, what order considerations are going to be gone through, okay, because of the way it's wound up. So that's all plastered. So now the words are all over the place. The content of the quads is all twisted and rotated. but the numbers look just great. And then what do? Then the other one, whether it's main character or overall story, lines it all up again, screws it all up twice. Now, not only are the words doubly screwed up, the positions within each quad, things are mixed up, but also the 1, 2, 3, 4 is all mixed up, creating all those hairpin turns and all those N shapes and Z shapes and C shapes and U shapes and everything that we talked about that we were observing. Now you can begin to see how that happens because time has been shot to hell. And then on that final total mixed up thing, you put the circuit. And the circuit then gives everything a potential. And then what do? You take the whole thing, unwind it all back to the static thing. And when you do, now the 1, 2, 3, 4 and the PRCP are scattered all over the place on the chart because the chart was put back in the normal position. So it's like if you want something to match, you put a pencil on a table, you can put this side down and it makes sense, but this is all screwed up. You put that side down, it makes sense and touches the table. That's all screwed up. What you do in the end is you put it all back, and both 1, 2, 3, 4 and PRCP are all screwed up as labels put on each element in the chart, but one's doubly screwed up compared to the other. And which one's applied first is also based on questions that you've answered, in addition to whether it's the objective or the main character that winds up first. By the time you get through all that stuff, that's the conversion of your equation. What was the name of it?
Euler's.
Euler's equation that converts, in this case, time to space and back again, both ways, okay? This is the equation that they're looking for to convert time to space in terms of E equals mc squared. It is what's happening here in the mind because it happens in a narrative that describes the mind, and without anybody ever seeing it there, once you go back to it and look at the patterns that are a narrative and you know it's a mind, then you see that it's got the spatial aspect of understanding and the temporal aspect of sequential understanding, and that both of those are necessary in order to try to resolve a problem. And it's the relationship between the two where time and space can be transmuted from one to another. And I believe that's kind of the next space step in doing, some Einstein-Rosen bridges, Anyway, so that I'd love to see a mathematician look into that stuff. But anyway, the only place that's used really is in figuring out signposts and journeys and the plot sequence report. To me, it's the most magnificent part of the model, but because it never really had to be included complete, the patent that we have on the story engine is a patent for putting things in a table that have relationships among items that are listed as in the appendix, and anybody can see that. But the live model does this. And wherever a copy of it exists, somewhere in some archives in the dungeons of Wright Brothers, that used to be screenplay systems where they keep the real Bob McKee, and they have their clone out there,
He is the story engine.
Yes, exactly. So, whereas I personally take on the role of Star-Lord. Okay. So, okay, that takes care of that part of it. Now, before I move into something that's less nuts than that, okay, I talked about that, and I talked about that, I talked about that, and actually, I think I've pretty much covered all the stuff I wanted to cover tonight in terms of at least touching on all of the stuff that comes out of this amazing little thing. You look at this tiny little shape here of the quad, and everything we talked about, including ultimately getting 64 items out of it that are identical to the relationships in the I Ching, including being able to assign logic equations to it by position, so that when you put something in a particular position, it means it's occupying that point in the logic equation. And by the way we figured it out, once we have the first equation, we just put the whole thing on a napkin over lunch one day and rotated the napkin sideways, so we sort of flipped it over, and we ended up with A, K, T, D, and then we flipped it downward, and we ended up with the T, D, and the A, K, and then we flipped it back this way, and we ended up with the D, T, and the K, A. So that is how we started, was those 4 items. I guess the last thing I would leave you with tonight, before we wrap it up here, is I did this last week when we did the writers group, just had a little chat. But one of the things about the quad that's most amazing is it turns processes into objects, sort of like object-oriented programming, where you can say, here's a process and we're going to use it as a building block and call it here, here, and here in our process, overall process. And it'll be one little process that runs by itself, and then it gets its gazinner and it gives its gazouter, and then it moves on to some other process. And the way we string them together, you know, it's almost like little robotics pieces that do things when we stick them together. It also bears a lot of resemblance to DNA. We talked about this last week, and that is that you start with need and want and need, and can and should. Need and should, can and want. These were terms that Dramatica started with, which is want and can. Okay. So anyway, these were things that Dramatica started with. It was can, need, want, should, we called it. Can, need, want, should. And then in fact, we had discussions with Steve Greenfield, Chris and I, at the very beginning over lunch, where we were talking about need, and we were saying, you know, there's nothing that you really need absolutely objectively. He says, of course there is. You need air to breathe. Well, if you're trying to suffocate yourself, you don't need air to breathe. Or he'd say you need to breathe. Well, you don't need to breathe because if the air right now is poisoned, you've got to hold your breath until you get out of there. You don't need to breathe right now, okay? It's all contextual. It's all contextual. And from that, we started saying, well, what happens when you go beyond that and you start saying, well, let me consider other things that are contextual. You go, need, can, need, want, and should, and you start moving up and you start talking about the situation and the circumstances, okay, circumstances, and the sense of self, who you think you are, and the state of being, who you really are, okay, and how that compares, the state of who you really are compared to who you think you are. Well, that's like the movie The Big Chill by Lawrence Kasdan. That's all about reevaluating. We thought we were the movers and shakers who were going to change the world and stop doing all these practices in business that were horrible and everything. And here we are 10 years later doing the exactly same thing. We are not who we think we are. And that's really what it was all about. Perfectly timed, big success. That was sort of the second quad, is that we have this quad, and then we move to that quad. And then we move to one more quad. I'll just put it over here. It's actually quite linear. But that other quad has responsibility, okay, and commitment and obligation and rationalization. Now, at first we called the whole thing rationalization until we came to this quad because we thought the whole process was just rationalizing. You know, you're just coming up with excuses by looking at text. And we all do that. We do it where we do something for a particular reason, but then we tell somebody it's for another reason because the real reason is embarrassing or it's self-serving, and we don't want them to know that, so we give them another reason for doing it that makes perfect logical sense, and there's no way for them to double check which one it is because we only know the truth in our heads. And then we do the funny thing. The funny thing is we actually say, well, you know, I know I was actually sort of considering that in the back of my mind, that that was a reason for doing it, the altruistic thing. And in fact, you know, I'm sure that must have been what made me do it. And by the time you're finished, you convince yourself that you actually did it for the reason that wasn't the real reason. Okay, that's justification. And if you go through it 4 times, you no longer see the reason you really did it. If you cover it with 4 layers, that's what the chart's all about. Yeah, if you cover it with 4 layers. So we've got this other quad here of these items. And then we found there was one even more basic than can, need, want, and should. And that one that's more basic was knowledge, thought, ability, and desire. So you can see how ability suddenly becomes restricted as what you can do because, yeah, I'm able to do it. Able to do, you know, I'm going to get in a lot of trouble. I'm going to go to jail or I'm going to mess up a friendship. So I can't really do that. This is what I can do, okay? Or, yeah, I'm able to give you $1,000, but if I do, I won't be able to make my rent. So I can't do that. What I can do is give you $100, okay? And things like that. And the same thing with need, the same thing with should. I mean, what you want and what you should versus what you desire, okay? You desire something, and it's limited when you desire something and you then put limitations upon it. So it turns out that this is the first step that is the only one that is not a justification. It's an accurate assessment of what you know, what you're able to do, what you think, and what you desire. And that is as close to Zen as you can get right there. If you ever get in that state, you're probably not thinking. You've probably reached that point where everything is balanced. And for a moment anyway, on the head of a pin, you're sitting there with 1,000 angels, okay? And you're all mindless, okay? And then something comes up and you carry it to this level as you say, all right, something's amiss here. I've got some kind of a disturbance in the force and things aren't balanced. So I'm going to move to this quad and see what it is. Well, there's some limitations here. Okay, well, within these limitations, where should I go? Well, here's the situation, and I might be able to do this, and here's the circumstances, which is kind of the emotional equivalent of the situation. Well, I don't want to offend anybody, by doing that. You see all this kind of stuff in the political campaigns that are prevalent right now. And then you get down to a sense of self and a state of being. Who do I think I am versus who I really am? We never see ourselves accurately, so that's always going to be a differential in there. And then finally we say, well, this is my responsibility. Nobody else is going to be able to do this except me. Or I've been assigned to it. Everybody's counting on me. I got to do that. My responsibility. Or I made a commitment. I don't care if I'm trying to save a painting that I know has been destroyed because I made a promise I'd try. And I'm going to keep that commitment because my friend that I promised died. So I know the painting's been destroyed. I saw it destroyed, but I'm going to go get the bits, okay? Because that's a commitment. And obligation is a sense where you feel that you owe somebody. You owe somebody, so you have to do it. Is that real? Hell no. You don't owe anybody anything. But if you want to have an ongoing relationship with them, or if you feel that they did something for you and you just won't be able to sleep at night because they're gone, they're dead, and the only thing they wanted was their body taken back to a certain place for burial, then you have this obligation to them to do it. Do you really? Do they know what's going on? Of course you don't. But you're not dealing with knowledge, thought, ability, desire. You're all the way up here in fourth level justification, dealing with obligation, okay? And maybe you end up dying because you're meeting an obligation for somebody who doesn't even know you're doing it, okay? Where's the sense in that? It's not about sense. It's about passion, okay? Passion is, this is dynamics. Justification is dynamics. Justification is how we move from clear thinking and by making choices that we have to make because of adapting to the world at large and altering to match what we cannot change when we're trying to make up our narrative action plans, and eventually sometimes we have to be the one that changes. And all the compromises we make and everything along the way lead us into these conclusions until we reach up there where we finally hit rationalization at that last part, and then we're basically saying, this is the reason I was doing it and believing it, even though it really wasn't the real reason we started out with. It's just the reason when we said, oh, I desire that. And by the end, I'm doing it for the good of everyone, okay? And we believe it, okay? When we believe it. And when you get through those 4 levels, which is what happens between a main character and an influence character. The influence character is trying to strip away all of these levels of justification that the main character has gone through to say, the situation's changed, Scrooge, and the way you thought the world was, it's not like that anymore. Or it was in your little world, but you're in a bigger world now, and you're growing up, and you have lots of money, and it's not like that anymore. You have people who actually love you and care for you, but you'll never get them to see it. It's a blind spot. They can't see it because they've rationalized it into disexistence, okay? And therefore, the only way to approach it is you can't unwind justification the way you came. What you have to do is you have to hit it from the side, okay? So if this is the whole process, first here, and then second here, and then third here, and then fourth there, what you have to do is take each one and hit it from the side, okay? And eventually, you can get rid of maybe a point of this, and a point of that, and a point of this, and a point of that, and then you've weakened all of them, and that's what the influence character does. By his influence, signpost by signpost, journey by journey, act by act, Niagara Falls, slowly returning. What happens is they go through the side and they begin to dismantle all of these quads. And eventually, they're able to dismantle in some order, depending on what the dynamics are and the choices you made. You eventually are able to get rid of all of these except one, okay? And that then becomes the final point at which they have to make a leap of faith. If it's a leap of faith story, remember there can be a leap of faith or a creep of faith. A creep of faith is where the main character just is changed by the experience and may not even ever know it. But we, as the audience or reader, have to know it in order to understand the message of the story, whether it was good that he did or not. He may never see it. That's a creep of faith. You're just changed, and you suddenly wake up one day and say, wow, I guess I feel differently about that, or you don't never even notice. But the reader has to know. Or it's a leap of faith where you have to say, I don't know. We've gotten down to where we only have 1 point. We don't actually have the justifications anymore. We just got 1 point of each of those quads. And I'm looking at it and I'm saying, I don't know if those things are going to get me changing the way I've been looking at these things is going to solve this problem, because it's always a choice between what you have gotten in the way of experience in life and in stories that has always worked. And if you just stuck with it long enough, it's always worked. But now you're coming up with an exception that is not going away. Do you go with what's been tried and true and always worked before, but seems to maybe be primed to fail this time? Or do you go with what the influence character says, which is the opposite on one point, which is the problem element? And then you're going with the new kid on the block that's never been tried, but seems to explain everything your old system explained, and also what's going on currently. So it explains more, but you've never seen it in action, versus something you've seen work again and again and again and again, but this time it's getting close and there's still no relief, okay? So do you abandon it or not? That's why a leap of faith is a leap of faith. You just don't know which is the right way. And there is no right way. It's only what the author says is the right way, whether it leads to success or failure and good or bad at the end, okay? But dismantling this has to be done sideways. It can't be done, just get rid of this, go back to this, go back to that, go back to that, because there's resistance there. It's like a diode. It's one way, okay, one-way mirror. You only pass through the Stargate in this direction. You can't go back in that direction. You have to go over to another planet, and then you can take a Stargate to another thing, and then you have to go to another planet and take a Stargate. So you have to do it sideways, from laterally. Again, 90 degrees to the flow in which it was created.
Is this analysis part of your character building, or is this this is all in the way that the way it formulates all your answers? I mean, how do you...
Yeah. Well, when you see the windups are based on this process. That's why it goes up 4 levels of windup, is to take you through 4 levels of justification. And that's why there is a windup on the objective and a windup on the main character and a 1, 2, 3, 4 and a PRCP, because those are the 4 levels of justification, because there's 4 levels, each of which gets screwed up.
So when we're building our characters, do you want us to go through all these, answer all these questions for each character?
As a practical sense, I would say if you're dealing with your main character, since these terms don't really get used the same way in the model that they originally were, because these were the first ones we came up with before he came up with all the rest, I would say if you took, what did the characters start out knowing and thinking, and what were their abilities and what were their desires, and then what limitations came upon them. This is great for building backstory, because that's all justification is. Justification is the story of backstory. It's how did this character get to this mindset that's in conflict with the way things are. Okay, that's what backstory is all about. So if you were to actually use this process on your main character, you would then at the end of it have a really good map of how they got into this fix. And again, if you look at A Christmas Carol, it's very well figured out, because you start with this and you end up with that, and you go through this and then you finally conclude here, so that you go through all those processes that the ghosts take him back to see how he ended up the person he is here, okay? But approaching them, again, sideways from all 4 of the ghosts. So that's a wonderful map. If somebody were just to create something that had, each of these items, 16 items, and then ask a question about each one, would be a nice addition to Dramatica for figuring out backstory and understanding your character, so that you then could take that and answer your questions about the structure from an illuminated perspective about how your character got his attitude, his situation, or into the activities that, how he got to where he is, why he feels the way he is. And in fact, you could use that. A lot of people, you take your archetypes and you create sub-stories, so that any archetype can be the main character in his own sub-story. And that's when you get down into looking at those personal relationships with the big brother and the little brothers. That's like taking an archetype or an elemental character of, I should say something about that too. These processes could explain why that character feels as he does. Why does he feel his little brother is this way? Why does the little brother feel the big brother is that way? How does that occur? You can create sub-stories for any character where they're the main character in their own sub-story. And then when they're dealing with the sub-story issue, it's just like another little story. And this can explain why those characters came to be that. And in fact, you could even use this, if you did it right, to figure out why a reason archetype is a reason archetype. Why is he a reason archetype? In Dramatica, it just says he is a reason archetype because you've said so. And that is his function. How did he come to be a person who would accept that function? Why does he have that function? Why does he do that? Well, because of this. That leads him to be a reasoned character because of his experiences. He focused on reason above all else, or on skepticism. Why is he such a skeptic? Well, because of this. That's how he got. So if you wanted to go into great depth in your characters, you could give them a lot just using this little system of 4 quads. Yeah. So, yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I had one more thing I was going to say, but I forgot what it was. It's pretty cool, but it's just a detail. So again, all of this, justification, 2 windups, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and the PRCO, you can see that the 2 windups, the 1, 2, 3, 4, and the PRCO is a quad, believe it or not. And one of them is simple. The 1, 2, 3, 4, and the PRCO, that's the easy to understand level. The 2 windups are the ones that are like space and time. They're the ones that are the next generation up. It creates a quad of what's happening in the justification process, which can also be seen as, for an individual character, how they went through these 16 items in these 4 quads. But it all comes out to just what you understand about the secrets of the quad, of which you now are all possessed. So I have given you most of the secrets I know that I can think of. There may be a few more I haven't thought to give you, but I've tried to give you all of my secrets about what this simple little cubbyhole is that you can put things into, and how many different things it has to satisfy. Any valid kind of quad operation or arrangement has to be able to work with it, or you've got something wrong in the 4 items you're trying to put into a quad, if they don't satisfy all of these things, okay? So there it is, the secrets of the quad, and now it's your job to either spread them around, pretend 3 times before dawn that you never heard it, or perhaps take this work and carry it to the next level and come up with some secrets of your own. Okay? All right. So again, my sympathies for having listened to all of this tonight. And a reminder that next Saturday, this is just for you who are listening in live, we are doing a full-day course called Learn Characters in a Day. Last one was Learn Dramatica in a Day, which basically gave all of the key things you need to know about the theory and the software. And that's been very popular. We had a lot of people get the recorded version afterwards and purchase that. You can attend the class for $145 here in Burbank at Wright Brothers, where we are right now. You can tune in on streaming video live and ask questions during the course for $79.95, or you can wait till it's all over and recorded and edited and get the full day course in streaming video that you can access anytime on Dramatica.com for $49.95. And we are going to cover, Jim and I together, everything from theoretical character stuff to techniques for coming up with charismatic characters and dealing with such things as the 4 P's of character: psychology, personality, persona, and presentation, which basically is how we all work in real life, where we put different layers upon what our basic psychology is and move ourselves out to what we're actually going to tailor our presentation with various people. All of that, how to come up with characters from scratch, how to come up with characters for plot, how to use the idea spinner method to develop your characters, character dossiers and why they're important, character secrets and how they can be used. So a lot of this is not even Dramatica, but it's all hand in glove with Dramatica. It's taking what you would learn from the structure and carrying it all the way through story encoding, story weaving, and story reception, where you do your actual writing and dealing with how can I have an impact on my reader or audience by wording what I say about my character a certain way, stand in their shoes, get in their heads and hearts, create real relationships, make them appear to be real people. So that's the kind of stuff we'll be dealing with. And again, that is next Saturday, and it will be available in recorded form forever after we actually do the class and get it edited. Now for Jim, you can finish off there.
No, I was just going to stop it.
Just stop it. Okay. Jim is going to stop it now.
I'm going to hit the stop button.